she got where she is because of her last name, not her work. That is what my brother wrote about me in an anonymous HR complaint. 31 words in a 47-page document meant to end my career. I want you to hold that sentence for a moment, because I need you to know what those words cost me. I had worked at Hartwell and Associates for 4 years. 4 years of compliance audits, late filings, and regulatory deadlines that nobody celebrated. 4 years of doing the work that kept the company out of trouble. And in December of that year, I was named Senior Compliance Director. Seth was passed over. By the following Monday morning, that complaint had been filed. I'll tell you exactly what was in it. But I need to start at the beginning, because the part that matters most in this story doesn't happen in the HR office. It happens in a small conference room on the 3rd floor, when an investigator looks up from my file and says something I have not been able to forget since. Stories like this one don't usually get told. The quiet ones, the ones who win without yelling, they tend to just get back to work. I'm here for them. If you've ever had someone try to take something you earned, you already know the particular kind of silence that follows. The one where you can't explain what happened because you're still trying to understand it yourself. Stay with me. This is going to take a while, but it ends somewhere worth arriving. Subscribe if this is your first time here, and let's get back to it. My name is Claire Merritt. I was 31 years old in the December this happened. I had been a compliance analyst at Hartwell and Associates since I was 27. Hartwell is a mid-sized insurance firm in Hartford, Connecticut. The kind of place that doesn't make headlines and doesn't try to. About 400 employees. A reputation for being careful. The kind of company that, when a regulatory filing is due, actually files it. I came to the work through my father. Robert Merritt had been a labor attorney for 28 years before he died. He believed that the rules of a workplace mattered, not as bureaucratic friction, but as protection. He told me once that the person who understood the employee handbook better than anyone else in a room was usually the safest person in that room. It was the kind of thing he said in the kitchen over coffee, quietly, as if he were telling me something true that no one else had thought to say out loud. When he died, I kept a few things from his office. One of them was a plain blue employee handbook from the firm, where he'd done consulting work in the 90s. He had annotated it in pencil, margin notes, underlines, a few flagged pages. I had no use for it, but I kept it on my shelf in my home office because it still looked like his handwriting. At Hartwell, I was one of 2 compliance analysts reporting to a senior director named Vivian Park. Vivian was precise, fair, and not easily impressed. She had been running the compliance department for 11 years. Getting a nod from Vivian was the professional equivalent of a standing ovation. I had been collecting those nods for 4 years. My days were structured and quiet. I arrived before most people. I tracked regulatory calendars, audited internal processes, drafted policy updates that most employees would never read but would absolutely need if something went wrong. I was good at it. Not in the way that demanded recognition, but in the way that meant the files were always in order and the deadlines were never missed. Seth worked in sales. He was 3 years older and had been at Hartwell 2 years longer than I had. He sold group insurance policies to mid-size employers across New England. He was good at the surface part of the job, the lunch meetings, the handshakes, the confident summaries. Less reliable on the details. He had missed 3 quarterly targets in a row the year before this happened. I knew that because quarterly targets were part of the compensation disclosures I processed. We had never been close. That is the honest version. Growing up, Seth and I had existed in parallel. Same table at dinner, same arguments about the television, same gradual drift into different lives. He was our mother's favorite in the uncomplicated way that some families organize themselves. One child carries the expectations. The other carries the ease. Seth had always carried the ease. When I joined Hartwell, he seemed pleased. Family in the same company, a shared commute twice a week, a standing lunch on Thursdays. For about a year, it worked. Then I was assigned to the Holloway Project. The Holloway Project was a large-scale internal compliance review commissioned by the board. It involved cross-departmental data, regulatory risk mapping, and a 90-day deliverable timeline that no one believed was realistic. Vivian asked me to lead it. I said yes. I worked on it for 14 months, the original timeline extended twice, and when it concluded, the board cited it as the most comprehensive internal review in the company's history. 3 policy changes were implemented from my recommendations. Vivian gave me a written commendation. Seth had been included early in the project as a sales liaison. He attended 6 meetings. He contributed 1 section of background data that I had specifically requested. On the final report, his name appeared in the acknowledgments. I noticed, around month 9, that he had submitted that background section to his own manager as evidence of a completed project contribution. I saw it in a forwarded email. I didn't say anything. I saved the email. The blue handbook sat on my shelf at home. I hadn't touched it since I moved in. The compliance work at Hartwell was the kind of job that most people didn't notice until something went wrong. I liked that about it. I wasn't doing work that required an audience. I was doing work that required precision. There is a particular satisfaction in that, in knowing that the reason nothing has gone wrong is because you kept it that way. My desk was in the northwest corner of the 2nd floor. It faced a partition wall with a whiteboard I used for tracking deadline cycles, quarterly filings, annual reviews, the rolling calendar of regulatory submissions that governed everything. I kept my coffee on the left side. I kept a legal pad on the right. I didn't keep personal photographs. I had never found a reason to explain myself to a room that already understood what I was doing there. My colleagues in compliance were 2 other analysts, Davis, who had been there 8 years and was meticulous in a way that bordered on ceremonial, and Priya, who was 2 years out of graduate school and moving with a speed and accuracy that I recognized as the beginning of someone building a real career. We didn't socialize much outside the department. We didn't need to. The work was company enough. I had learned this discipline from watching my father work. Robert Merritt ran his practice out of a home office for the last decade of his career. I had done my homework at a table 20 feet from his desk. I had watched him read, underline, annotate, and file. I had watched him lose a case he had prepared for months and come back to the table the next morning and keep working. He didn't explain much about what he was doing. He just did it, consistently, with a patience I was still learning to fully inherit. I also inherited his handwriting. Small, slanted slightly to the right. Precise without trying to be. When Vivian told me about the promotion, she told me something else too. She said the board had specifically noted my name when discussing the Holloway Project outcomes, not the project, my name. She said that didn't happen often in a company of 400 people, where individual contributions tend to flatten into team results on their way up the chain. I had not told Seth about the promotion before the announcement. We weren't close enough for that conversation, and something I couldn't name had made me careful about giving him information before I had to. That Sunday night before the announcement, I had made pasta and eaten it at my kitchen table with a regulatory update newsletter I had been meaning to read for 3 weeks. It was an ordinary evening. I wasn't celebrating yet. I was just waiting for Monday, the way you wait for any morning that will be different from the one before. The handbook was on the shelf then, too, where it always was. I hadn't opened it in months. In November, Vivian called me into her office. She had a folder on her desk. She opened it and showed me the offer letter before she explained it. Senior Compliance Director. A reporting line directly to the board. A $94,000 increase from my current salary. Your work on Holloway, she said, specifically the regulatory risk tier you designed. The board wants it institutionalized and they want you leading that effort. I said thank you. I meant it from somewhere deep. She told me the announcement would go out the following Monday. On Sunday night, I set my alarm for 6. I ironed a blouse. I made a list of 3 things I wanted to accomplish in my first month. I fell asleep at 11, which for me was early. On Monday morning, Seth was not at the standing lunch. By Monday afternoon, I knew why. I learned about the complaint from Vivian at 3:17 in the afternoon. I remember the time because I had just logged the completion of a quarterly audit and was about to close my laptop. She asked me to come to her office. She closed the door, which she rarely did. There has been a complaint filed with HR, she said. Anonymous. It came in this morning. She did not hand it to me. She told me the broad strokes. The complaint alleged that I had misrepresented my credentials during the Holloway project, that I had inflated my role in the final report, that I had cultivated an inappropriate mentorship relationship with Vivian to secure the promotion unfairly. I sat very still. Is there a name attached? I asked. She said no. Anonymous complaints trigger mandatory review. She said she had no choice but to refer it to the Ethics and Compliance Division, which handled all internal investigations independently from the department. She said the promotion would be suspended pending the outcome. I want to be clear about something. Vivian's voice was not unkind. She was careful with it. She looked at me the way people look at you when they have to deliver something that is going to cost you something, and they know it. But the promotion would be suspended. I said okay. I don't know why I said okay. It was a reflex. The word that comes out when you are trying to keep your face level. I walked back to my desk. I sat down. I opened a spreadsheet I had been working on for an unrelated audit, and I stared at it for a long time without seeing any of the numbers. My brother was in the building, 3 floors down. He had a window office in the east wing that overlooked the parking garage. I had been to that office. I knew the exact chair he kept for visitors. A low-backed fabric chair he'd brought from his previous job that made people feel slightly uncomfortable, slightly off balance, which he believed gave him an advantage. I didn't go downstairs. I drove home. I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes before going inside. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard. I made dinner. I did not call anyone. I opened my laptop and pulled up my Hartwell personnel file. Every document I was permitted to access, offer letters, performance reviews, commendations, the Holloway project file. I arranged them in a folder on my desktop. I named the folder Clarity. I went to my home office. I stood at the shelf. The blue handbook was exactly where I always kept it, between a law school case compendium and a travel guide to Portugal I had never used. Plain blue cover. The words Employee Rights and Workplace Standards on the spine in faded gold letters. I took it down. I held it. My father's pencil marks were faint now, 17 years gone. But they were there. Little checks in the margins. A phrase circled on page 43, documentation is the quiet form of standing your ground. I put it on my desk. I want to tell you what that conference room felt like. It was small. 2 chairs. 1 table. The kind of temporary office that has no personality because it belongs to whoever needs it next. But Marcus had been there for several days, and it had begun to take on the quality of a room where serious things had happened. The water glass was clean. The folders were stacked with intention. There was a jacket on the back of his chair. When he spoke, he was not performing authority. He was the authority. There is a difference. Authority performed is loud and positional. Real authority is quiet and accurate, and you understand what you're sitting across from. I had sat across from it before. My father had it. He had it in the way of someone who had spent decades being the person who read the most carefully and stayed the most level. Marcus read from his folder in the same measured way my father used to read from a brief. Sentence by sentence. Not rushing to the conclusion, letting each piece stand before it was connected to the next. He had done something I hadn't expected. He had requested the full Holloway project file from the server, not just my documentation, the entire thing. Every contributor's file, every submission, the complete version history. He had gone through it systematically. He had mapped the contributions to the acknowledgments to the complaint's allegations. And when he laid it out, the structure of what Seth had done became visible in the kind of way that does not require interpretation. He had filed a complaint about credit he had received. Not credit he had been denied. Credit he had, in fact, been given. His name was on page 3 of the final report. The complaint's central allegation, denied contribution, was directly refuted by the document the complainant himself had included as evidence. I don't think Seth had read it carefully enough. I think he had assembled the complaint in the heat of the moment, in the particular fever of someone who feels wronged and is rushing to act before the feeling passes. He had pulled documents that were true, that showed he had been involved in the project, without checking whether those same documents undermined the argument he was making with them. It was the kind of oversight that doesn't happen to people who are careful. It was the kind of oversight I would have caught. When Marcus said the words, "The complaint is not substantiated," I heard them the way you hear something you had already known was true, but hadn't let yourself believe until someone official confirmed it. Not relief, exactly, more like the settling that happens when something that has been suspended finally lands. I thought about my father, briefly, not sentimentally. Just, he would have read the complaint in 3 hours and found exactly what Marcus found. He would have made a note on a legal pad. He would have made coffee and gone to bed. In the morning he would have built his response with the same quiet patience he brought to everything. I had done that. Not as well as he would have. But I had done it. Marcus said, "Your father was a good man." I said, "He was." There was nothing else to say. That was enough. I picked up the coffee cup and finished it. I thanked him. I put the blue handbook back in my bag. I walked out of the building into the Hartford cold and stood on the sidewalk for a full minute before I moved again. The investigation was over. The work was still mine. It had always been mine. I had grown up watching my father navigate difficult situations without raising his voice. It was not performed calm. It was structural. He had told me once, I was maybe 16, sitting in his office while he reviewed a deposition, that the person who stayed the most level in a conflict was usually the person who had done the most preparation. Emotion was a response to uncertainty. When you knew exactly what you had and what it meant, emotion didn't have anywhere to go. I thought about that sentence for the first time in years as I sat at my kitchen table with the Clarity folder open in front of me. The documents were all there. Everything I had ever been asked to produce. The original Holloway Project scope document, dated with my initials as lead analyst. Every regulatory submission I had authored over 4 years. My graduate transcripts. My professional certifications, current and verified. The performance reviews, 3 of them. 1 for each full year I had been at Hartwell, each one written by Vivian, and each one documenting specific projects and specific outcomes in the language of someone who was watching carefully. There was nothing in my file that didn't belong there. I read the complaint again, more slowly this time. All 47 pages. The structure of it was careful. That was the thing that settled in me the most uncomfortably. It had been assembled with attention. It cited meeting dates. It cited the sequence of the Holloway Project timeline. It cited 3 instances of me meeting with Vivian outside of formal review sessions, a working lunch in September, a call in October, a follow-up in November, and framed them as evidence of preferential access rather than normal professional collaboration. Anyone who had worked on a 14-month project with a senior director would have had those meetings. They weren't unusual. But in the narrative of the complaint, they read as a pattern. I knew how documents worked. I had built my career around understanding how documents worked. I knew that a document could tell a technically accurate story and still be fundamentally misleading. That was the compliance professional's particular education in human nature. The gap between what was true and what a record said was true could be very narrow and very consequential. What I also knew was that my records were complete. 4 years of work. Every deadline. Every filing. every revised policy, every version of every document I had produced for the company, saved in chronological order in a filing system I had built and maintained with the same discipline my father had used for his case files. I was not going to be undone by a gap in the record. The question was whether the investigator would see what I saw. I closed the folder at 11:42. I washed my coffee cup. I turned off the kitchen light. I went to my home office and stood at the bookshelf for a long moment. The blue handbook looked back at me the way objects do when you've kept them past the point of usefulness, not for what they do, but for what they mean. I went to bed. I did not hear from Seth. Not that night, not the next morning. What I didn't know yet was what the complaint actually said. I found out on day 2. The Ethics and Compliance Division contacted me to schedule my initial interview. The HR coordinator, a woman named Beth Landon, sent me a summary document outlining the scope of the investigation. Standard procedure. I was entitled to review the allegations. I printed it at home. 47 pages. The complaint was thorough in the way that takes time. It had dates. It had names. It had a timeline of my involvement in the Holloway project that was accurate in every detail except the ones that mattered most. It framed my contributions as derivative, my relationship with Vivian as orchestrated, my credentials as embellished. And near the bottom of page 9, tucked into a paragraph about professional conduct, was the line I already knew was there. She got where she is because of her last name, not her work. Not attributed. Anonymous, but I knew the shape of that sentence. I had heard it before, at a company dinner 3 years ago, when Seth had too many drinks, and said it to a colleague I later found out had repeated it back to him. Embarrassed, I set the document down. I opened the Clarity folder. I did not sleep well that night. If you've ever had someone try to rewrite what you built, someone who knew exactly what it was worth because they'd watched you build it, drop one word in the comments. I'll see you there. And stay with me, because the part where it turns is coming. The investigator assigned to my case was named Marcus Webb. I learned his name from the appointment confirmation Beth Landon sent me. Marcus Webb. Senior Ethics Investigator, 22 years in workplace compliance, external contractor retained by Hartwell for independent reviews of sensitive cases. I looked him up, the way you look someone up when you're trying to know how afraid to be. He had a brief professional profile online. Retired from a large regional labor law firm. Specialized in internal investigations, workplace disputes, and what the profile called compliance culture development. There was a photo. A man in his late 50s, gray at the temples. The kind of face that had listened to a lot of people. I read the profile twice. I had never met him. I went into work each morning as if nothing had changed. That required a specific kind of effort. Not performance. I was not performing anything. But the work required presence. And presence required that I not spend my working hours rehearsing arguments I had no forum for yet. So I showed up. I opened the regulatory calendar. I reviewed the quarterly filings. I logged the deadlines. I did the job the same way I had done it for 4 years, which was the only response I had access to. Davis noticed nothing. Priya noticed something but said nothing, which I respected. Vivian and I communicated by email for the first 3 days. The messages were professional and brief and perfectly calibrated. We were both experienced enough to understand that we couldn't have a real conversation until the investigation was finished. Seth was 3 floors down. I didn't go to that floor. I used the stairwell closest to the compliance office and the parking garage entrance. I timed my lunch to miss the peak period in the main break room. This was not hiding. It was resource conservation. I had a limited amount of composure available, and I was not going to spend it on an accidental hallway conversation that I had no good way to navigate. On the second evening, I called a friend named Jocelyn, who had known my father and had been in HR management for 15 years at a healthcare company in Boston. I didn't tell her the details. I told her enough. She listened without interrupting, which I had always appreciated about her. She said, "Do you have documentation?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then you're fine. The only people who lose these things are the ones who aren't organized." It was the most practical comfort she could have offered. I told her I'd update her when it was done. She told me to let me know. We hung up. I sat in my kitchen with the empty phone in my hand. I thought about what it would mean if I lost. I had tried not to think about it directly. But I thought about it now. Not the job. I could find another job. I had skills and a record, and I would recover. But the other thing. The thing that would be said about me at Hartwell. At this company where I had spent 4 years building a reputation, one deadline at a time. The version of the story that would live on if the investigation went the wrong direction. Claire Merritt. Got the promotion through connections, had it taken away. Resigned. I sat with that for a while. Then I opened my laptop and went back to work. The night before my meeting with Marcus, I didn't sleep easily. I ran through the documents again at midnight, not because I needed to, but because going through them was something I could do when there was nothing else available. I had my interview outline on the legal pad, not a script, just a sequence. The facts in the order they should be heard. My father had taught me that too. Know the shape of your story before you walk into the room. At 6:30 in the morning, I showered and made coffee and stood at the shelf. I put the handbook in my bag. I don't know exactly why I took it that morning. It had no function in the conference room. It was not evidence. It was not documentation. It was an annotated employee handbook from 1998 that my father had used on a consulting project I had never known the details of. But I wanted it nearby. There are things we carry not because they change outcomes, but because they change the person who is walking toward the outcome. I needed to walk into that room feeling like someone who had been built to do this, by someone who had believed the work mattered. I took the handbook. I drove to Hartwell. I sat in conference room 3 and waited for Marcus Webb. My interview was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9. Conference room 3, 3rd floor. Vivian's floor. I arrived at 8:52. I sat in the chair closest to the window, the one with the afternoon light in the afternoon and nothing notable about it in the morning. I had my laptop. I had a printed copy of my Clarity folder, the performance reviews, the commendations, the Holloway project timeline in my own words. I had a legal pad. I had a pen. I did not have the handbook. That was still at home. On my desk, where my father's handwriting still lived in the margins. Marcus Webb came in at exactly 9. He was taller than the photo suggested. He wore a plain dark blazer, a white shirt with no tie, and the specific kind of flat expression that belongs to people who have been in too many conference rooms to perform calm. They just are calm. It is a different thing. He set a file on the table. He sat down. He looked at me. And then he said my last name the way people say a last name when they recognize it. Merritt, not a question. Claire Merritt? Yes. He looked at me for a moment. He opened his file. He wrote something on the top of his legal pad. He looked up again. Your father was Robert Merritt. I went very still. I knew Robert, he said. Not closely. We overlapped at a labor law conference in Boston in 2003. And again at a mediation in 2007 I was consulting on. He was a thorough man. I heard he passed. Yes, I said. 6 years ago. Marcus nodded once. He looked back at his file. I want to be transparent with you, he said. The name connection doesn't change the scope of this investigation. But I want you to know I said it out loud, because I have an obligation to. If you'd prefer a different investigator, no, I said. I'd like to continue. He nodded again. All right. Let's begin. We talked for 2 hours and 18 minutes. I know, because I had turned the clock on my phone face up on the table so I could track the battery. Marcus asked about the Holloway project in the kind of detail that meant he had already read it carefully. He asked about my credentials, each one, and I walked him through the original applications, the verifications, the graduate coursework. He asked about my relationship with Vivian. I told him the truth. She was my supervisor. She had mentored me through 2 difficult audits. And the line between professional mentorship and favoritism, in my experience, was whether the work warranted it. He wrote things down. He asked me if I had any idea who filed the complaint. I said I had a strong suspicion. I told him about Seth. I did not say I was certain. I told him about the forwarded email from month 9 of the Holloway project. The one where Seth had submitted my background research to his own manager as his project contribution. I told him I had it saved. He asked if I had it with me. I did. I slid the printed email across the table. He read it. He read it a second time. He set it down. He wrote 1 line on his legal pad. At the end of the session, he said 2 things. First, don't discuss this with your colleagues. That's standard. Second, quieter, whatever happens with this case, your father would be proud of how you sat in that room. I drove home with both hands on the wheel. I did not stop anywhere. I went inside, went to my home office, and sat at my desk for a long time. The handbook was still there, the pencil annotations still faint in the margins. I didn't open it. I just looked at it. I made dinner. I called my mother, briefly. She asked how work was. I said busy. She said Seth had mentioned I was dealing with some internal stuff. She used his exact phrase. I said good night. That was day 3. On day 4, the mid-story setback came. The mid-story setback had its own particular texture. It was not the suspension itself that was the hardest part. It was the way work continued around it, the way the quarterly deadlines still arrived on the same schedule, and the regulatory filings still required the same precision, and the compliance calendar kept rolling forward as if the investigation did not exist. I kept working. I logged everything I produced during that period with extra care, additional timestamps. Because I understood that even if this resolved in my favor, I wanted a record of who I had been while it was unresolved. I also spent time, during that week, thinking about the second complaint. The 2 additional statements. I did not know who had provided them. I did not try to find out. But I thought about the shape of my 4 years at Hartwell and the places where someone might have looked at my relationship with Vivian and decided it meant something other than what it was. There had been a junior analyst the year before, someone who had been at the company for 8 months before leaving, who had twice asked Vivian for an assignment I was already leading. He had been polite about it, professionally managed, but the frustration underneath had been visible. He left in March of the previous year. I didn't know if he had been contacted. I didn't know if he had volunteered. There had also been a senior sales manager who had been on the Holloway steering committee in the early months. A man named Paul Bryce, who had disagreed with 2 of my regulatory risk assessments and had said so in a meeting in a way that had required Vivian to close it down. He and Seth had worked together for 3 years. They had lunch together twice a month. I noted the name in my legal pad, not for accusation. For context. Because understanding the landscape around a complaint was part of what I did for a living. That was the particular irony I hadn't allowed myself to name until that week. I was a compliance analyst. I had spent 4 years studying how workplaces managed disputes, documented conduct, and protected themselves from exactly this kind of problem. I knew the machinery I was inside. I knew what the investigation required, what the investigator would be looking for, and what documentation would carry the most weight. My brother had filed a complaint against the one person at that company who was most qualified to understand how to answer it. I wrote that sentence on my legal pad and then crossed it out, because writing it felt too close to satisfaction and I wasn't there yet. The Holloway archive discovery came on the 6th day, as I described, but what I haven't told you is what I did after I found it. I didn't immediately call Marcus. I sat with it for an hour. I made tea I didn't drink. I walked to the window. I came back to the desk. I read the exhibit one more time. What I was doing, I understood later, was making sure I was certain before I said anything. Because the thing about building a case on a document is that you have to be absolutely sure of what the document says before you tell anyone. A misread is not just a mistake. In a formal investigation, a misread is a liability. I was certain. Page 31. Exhibit C. Dated 14 months prior. Seth's name at the top. The background research section of the Holloway project, formatted as a standalone deliverable. Submitted into the complaint file as evidence of his denied credit. The same document, with different headers, that he had submitted to his manager as an independent project completion. They weren't the same file, they were the same underlying work. And the timestamps of both submissions were visible in the archive. The version history of the Holloway report showed the contribution as minor, acknowledged but not central. His manager's file showed it submitted as significant, standalone. He had overstated his contribution to his own manager. And then, in filing the complaint, he had inadvertently surfaced that discrepancy. I called Marcus's office and left the message. Then I put the handbook back on the shelf. I went to bed. I set my alarm for 6. In the morning, the counting resumed. The call came from the VP of Human Resources, a man named Gerald Torres. I had met Gerald twice in 4 years, once at a company meeting, once in an elevator. He was a reliable, careful man who communicated exclusively through official channels. When his name appeared on my phone at 4:43 in the afternoon, I understood this was not a routine check-in. He was brief. Professional, measured, Claire, he said. I want to let you know that the investigation has expanded slightly in scope. We have received 2 additional statements from colleagues who report they observed what they described as an unusual level of access between you and Vivian Park over the past 18 months. I want to be transparent that we take these corroborations seriously. There is no change to your employment status at this time. However, given the expanded scope, the timeline for the investigation has extended from our original 5-day estimate to 10 to 14 business days. I thanked him. I said I understood. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call. 2 additional statements. I thought about the colleagues I'd worked with. The ones who had been in the compliance department, in adjacent teams, who had seen my relationship with Vivian and made their own conclusions. I thought about the particular way a workplace narrates a woman's rise, the explanations people reach for when they'd rather not credit the work. I thought about Seth. He had been at Hartwell for 2 years before me. He had relationships I didn't have access to. He knew which colleagues were unsettled, who had applied for positions they didn't get, who carried small resentments they'd never named aloud. He was good at that part. He always had been. At family dinners when we were younger, he'd been the one who knew exactly what each person wanted to hear. It was useful in sales. It was useful in other ways too. I didn't know for certain he had approached those colleagues. But I knew the shape of what had happened. The complaint had grown legs. My promotion was still suspended. I was still going to work every day. I was still filing quarterly reports and processing policy updates and doing every piece of the job I had been doing for 4 years. I arrived on time. I left when my work was finished. I spoke to Vivian only in necessary professional exchanges. She looked at me with something careful in her eyes that I chose not to name. On the 6th day, I went back to my desk at home. I opened the Clarity folder. I went through it again, slowly, the way my father had taught me to read anything that mattered. Look for the thing that's too specific to dismiss. Look for the date that doesn't fit. Look for the detail that the other side didn't know you had. I found it in the Holloway Project archive. I had saved every version of every document, every draft, every email thread, every changelog. In the final report's version history, there was a record. Every edit, every contributor's tag, every timestamp. My name was on 94% of the document. The background data section Seth had contributed, the same section he had claimed as a project completion to his own manager, had been added in month 2 and had not been altered since. But there was something else. In the investigation file summary Beth Landon had sent me, the 47-page complaint, on page 31. There was an attached exhibit. The complainant had submitted supporting documentation. One of those documents was a project summary from the Holloway Review. Formatted professionally. Submitted, the complaint alleged as evidence that the complainant had been denied credit for their contributions. The project summary was Seth's. He had submitted, as evidence of his own unfair treatment, a document that showed his contribution. And his contribution was dated. And the date matched the forwarded email I had saved. He had accidentally put the proof in the file himself. I read it twice. I read it a third time. I pulled the blue handbook from the shelf and set it on the desk beside me. Documentation is the quiet form of standing your ground. I did not call anyone. I made a note of the page number and the exhibit number. I added it to the Clarity folder. I closed my laptop. I went to bed at 10:30 and slept the way you sleep when something you cannot name has shifted. Subscribe if you haven't. The part where it all comes together, the part where what he put in that file does exactly what he didn't mean for it to do, is just ahead. Seth called me on a Saturday. Day 8. I let it ring. He called again 40 minutes later. I picked up. He said my name the way he said it when he wanted something. A beat too warm. The warmth that was never quite natural on him. Claire, hey, I wanted to check in. I waited. I heard things have been rough at work. With the whole HR thing. I said I'm handling it. He paused. Then, look, I don't know what Vivian said to you about the Holloway report, but that project was a team effort. Some people feel like their contributions didn't get recognized. I said, what people? He was quiet for 2 seconds. Long enough to be a real answer. Look, he said. I'm just saying. If you want this to go away quietly, I think people would be willing to rethink some of the details. If there was more flexibility in how the final credits were framed. I want you to hear that sentence. If there was more flexibility in how the final credits were framed. He wanted me to rewrite history, to add his name to the work, to share credit I had not shared because it had not been shared work. And in exchange, the complaint would be reconsidered. He didn't say that last part. He didn't have to. This is the part of the story where I should tell you I said something sharp, something that cut through everything. I didn't. I said, Seth, I'm going to let you go. I hung up. After I hung up the phone, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote down what Seth had said. Verbatim, as best I could reconstruct it. Date. Time. His words. My words. The pause. If there was more flexibility in how the final credits were framed. I looked at that sentence for a long time. He hadn't offered to withdraw the complaint. He had offered to reconsider the details. That distinction mattered. It was the difference between someone who was backing down and someone who was still negotiating. He was still negotiating, even now, with an active investigation, with a trained investigator in a borrowed office on the 4th floor, reading his own evidence against him. He was still looking for the version where he got something. I had known Seth for 31 years. I had watched him do this at family dinners when the topic was who owed whom a favor. I had watched him do it in smaller ways, borrowing things without returning them, arriving late to things and explaining it in a way that somehow made the wait your fault. He was not a malicious person. I had spent a long time deciding whether he was, and I had concluded he wasn't. He was something more specific. He was a person who was convinced, without ever examining it, that he was owed more than he had. And when he didn't get it, he found someone to blame who was close enough to reach. I had always been close enough. I wrote the email to myself at 7:14 in the evening. Reconstructed dialogue from the Seth phone call, timestamped, I attached it to the Clarity folder. Then I called Marcus's office and left the message about the call. My mother's call came 3 days later. I want to tell you what her silence sounded like. The pause after she said I don't want this family to, and then stopped. It was not the silence of someone who couldn't find words. It was the silence of someone who had found the words and then chosen not to use them. That is a different thing. My mother had always known what she wanted to say. The question had always been whether she would say it. She didn't. And I understood, in that silence, that she never would. Not because she didn't believe me. I think some part of her always knew what Seth did. But because naming it would require her to take a side, and she had spent 30 years avoiding that geometry. I loved my mother. That sentence is fully true, and has nothing to do with what came after. After I said goodnight, I sat at my desk and thought about the people who had shown up over the past 2 weeks. Jocelyn on the phone, listening without fixing. Marcus Webb in a borrowed office, pouring coffee and saying a name with recognition in it. Vivian Park, careful and insufficient, and still glad when it came out right. Nobody had swept in. Nobody had rescued me. But people had stood in their corners of the situation and done what they could do. It was quieter than rescue. It was more useful. I put the legal pad away. I set my alarm. I picked up the blue handbook and put it in my bag for the morning. There are things you carry not for what they do but for what they remind you that you are. I drove to Hartwell at 8:45. I was early. I sat with the phone in my hand. I thought about the version of him I had known when we were 12 and 13, the brother who had taught me to ride a bike in the driveway on a July afternoon, who had stood at the end of the street to catch me if I fell. I thought about the person who had turned that into this. I could not reconcile them. I had stopped trying. I called Marcus's office number and left a message. I told him about the phone call. I told him I would have it in writing. I summarized it in an email to myself immediately after hanging up, with a timestamp. He called me back within the hour. He said, "Thank you for telling me, I'll note it." He said, "I need you in the office Monday. Not a formal interview. Just a conversation." I said, "What time?" He said 9. I said, "I'll be there." On Sunday, my mother called. I told her I was fine. She said Seth seemed stressed. She said she was worried about both of us. She said, and I could hear that she had rehearsed this part, that she hoped I understood that Seth had been going through a hard time, that his sales numbers had been difficult, that sometimes people did things when they were under pressure that they wouldn't otherwise do. I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "He's your brother." I said, "I know." She said, I don't want this family to." Her voice stopped. There was a long pause. I could hear the kitchen behind her, the sound of the faucet running, then stopping. She never finished the sentence. That was the nearest she came to saying it out loud. I said goodnight. I loved her. I knew she was choosing him without meaning to, in the quiet way parents sometimes choose the child who is harder to love, because they can't stop trying. Monday morning. I set my alarm for 6. I picked up the blue handbook from my desk. I held it for a moment. I put it in my bag. The meeting with Marcus was not in conference room 3. It was in his temporary office on the 4th floor, a borrowed space with 2 chairs and a table and a window that faced the interior courtyard. He was already there when I arrived. There was coffee. He poured a cup and set it in front of me without asking. He had my file open. My Clarity folder, printed, my original documents, and beside them, the 47-page complaint. He said, "I want to walk through something with you." He turned to page 31. The exhibit. Seth's project summary. "I need you to confirm this is the document you recognized." I said it was. He nodded. He opened a second folder. In it was a copy of the Holloway Project archive, the version history I had described in our first interview. He had pulled it from the company server. He pointed to the timestamp. Seth Merritt's contribution to the Holloway Project was submitted in month 2. The document he included as evidence of denied credit was dated from that same window. The complaint alleges that he was denied contribution credit in the final report. But the version history shows his contributions were documented and acknowledged in the report's contributor notes. He is listed by name on page 3. I said yes. He's in the acknowledgements. He was not excluded, Marcus said. He did less work than you, and the acknowledgements reflect that. The complaint's core allegation, that credit was redistributed unfairly, is not supported by the document the complainant himself submitted as evidence. He turned one more page. The email. My forwarded email. The one where Seth had submitted that same background research to his own manager as an independent project completion. This was provided by you in our first session. Combined with the version history, it establishes that the complainant claimed the work as his own contribution to a separate supervisor at the same time he was participating in the project as a liaison. That is a separate matter for Hartwell to address internally. He closed the folder. He looked at me. This investigation is concluded. My recommendation to Gerald Torres and the board is that the complaint is not substantiated. There is no credible evidence of credential misrepresentation, improper mentorship, or manipulated promotion. The complaint appears to have been motivated by the complainant's dissatisfaction with the outcome of the promotion process. I said okay. He said, the promotion will be reinstated. You'll receive official confirmation from Gerald's office by end of week. I looked at the coffee cup he'd poured. I hadn't touched it. He said, quieter, your father. When I knew him, he was the kind of person who kept records, not out of suspicion, because he believed the truth deserved documentation. I know, I said. He nodded. I want you to know I would have reached the same conclusion without the name, he said. The file stood on its own. But I am glad you sat in this room. Robert Merritt was a good man. I picked up the coffee cup. I took a drink. It was still warm. I walked out of the fourth-floor office and down the stairs, and I did not stop until I was in the parking garage, beside my car, with the cold Hartford November air coming through the concrete levels. I stood there for a long time. Then I took the blue handbook out of my bag. I opened it to page 43. My father's pencil circle, faded but there. Documentation is the quiet form of standing your ground. I closed it. I put it back in my bag. I got in my car. I drove home. I walked directly to my home office, and I placed the handbook back on the shelf, between the law school compendium and the travel guide to Portugal. Exactly where it lived. Then I made dinner. And I waited for Friday. The official confirmation came on Thursday, not Friday. Gerald Torres called me at 10:12 in the morning. He was brief, professional, measured, the same man he had always been. He said the investigation had concluded. He said the complaint had been found to be unsubstantiated. He said the promotion would be reinstated effective December 1st, with full back pay for the suspension period. He also said, carefully, in the measured way of someone reading something he had been coached to say, that the company would be addressing a separate internal matter regarding conduct during the Holloway project. He did not name Seth. He didn't need to. I thanked him. I meant it simply, not triumphantly, just as a fact. I went back to work. That afternoon, Vivian stopped by my desk. She stood beside it for a moment. She didn't sit down. She said, I'm glad it came out the right way. She said it the way people say things that are true but insufficient. Because they know it. I said, thank you, Vivian. She nodded and went back to her office. Seth was put on a performance improvement plan the following week, not for the complaint, or not only. The Holloway submission, the one he had claimed as an independent contribution to his own manager, became the anchor of a formal review of his conduct. He resigned before it concluded. I heard it from a colleague, not from him, not from my mother. My mother did not call me about it. I did not call her. We talked 2 weeks later, about other things. She mentioned Seth only once, briefly, that he was taking some time, figuring things out. I said I hoped he did. I meant it. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just as one true sentence about a person I had grown up with and no longer expected anything from. He never called to apologize. Some people reach that moment, The moment where they know what they should say, and they pick up the phone. And some people don't. I had learned not to measure a person by the apology they owed, only by what they chose. Marcus Webb sent me a short email 2 weeks after the investigation closed. 3 sentences. He said he was glad the outcome was what it was. He said that if I was ever interested in the investigative side of compliance work, there was a professional development organization he thought I might find useful. He signed it with his full name. I wrote back. I said thank you. I said I would look into it. On a Tuesday morning in January, I started my first week as Senior Compliance Director. I arrived early. I made coffee. I sat at a desk that now had a view of the Hartford skyline in the winter light, gray and clean and ordinary. I had brought the blue handbook. Not to use, not to display, just to have it there, the way you keep something in a room because it belongs to the room now. I set it on the shelf beside my new desk, between a compliance reference guide and a blank legal pad. My father's pencil marks still faint inside. The work was mine. It had always been mine. Integrity doesn't need an audience, but sometimes, if you're very lucky, someone who knew your father sees it anyway. That's my story. 1 report that was supposed to end me. 1 annotated book on a shelf. And an investigator who remembered a man I loved. If someone ever tried to take something you earned, if you've ever sat in a room and been asked to defend what you built, leave 1 word in the comments. Just 1. I'll see every one of them. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Share it with someone who keeps records and never talks about it. And I'll see you in the next one.